Bibles, go ahead and open to Matthew chapter 27. We will be there momentarily after I get started with something else. I'm going to do something a little different tonight. And before we get started into my lesson, I want us to sing a song. Turn to 740. 740. And this is going to be the basis of our lesson tonight. Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless, forsaken, betrayed by all. Hearken what meaneth the sudden call. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, oh friend, what will he do with me? Jesus is standing on trial still. You can be false to him if you will. You can be faithful through good or ill. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, oh friend, what will he do with me? Will you evade him as Pilate tried? Or will you choose him whatever betide? Vainly you struggle from him to hide. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, oh friend, what will he do with me? Will you, like Peter, your Lord deny? Or will you scorn from his foes to fly? Daring for Jesus to live or die. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, oh friend, what will he do with me? Jesus, I give thee my heart today. Jesus, I'll follow thee all the way. Gladly obeying thee will you say, this will I do with Jesus. What will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, oh friend, what will he do with me? Let's begin reading in Matthew chapter 27. Let's begin reading with verse 15. It said, Now at the feast of the governor was a custom to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted, and they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. Now the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." This song that we've just sung is ask a question that is based on a question that Pilate asked many years ago when he was getting ready to give the order to have Jesus crucified. Tonight, I want us to kind of use this song as an outline and answer this question: what shall I do with Jesus? And the first thing I want us to do is I want us to look at a couple of examples of what others did with Jesus the night he was taken to be crucified. And we're going to be skipping around at different accounts of the Gospels of Jesus and his crucifixion. But the first question I want to ask is this: what did Pilate do with Jesus? Well, there are actually several things Pilate did when he interacted with Jesus over the course of those few hours. And the first thing is that he believed that Jesus was innocent. Now, he didn't necessarily, based on the scripture, we can't necessarily say he believed in Jesus. But he did believe that Jesus was not guilty of what he was being accused of. And in several different accounts of the Gospels, he states that he believed that Jesus was not guilty, that he was innocent. In John chapter 18, verse 38, in Luke chapter 23, verse 4, and in Matthew chapter 27, verse 23, which we've just, I didn't read that far. Let me read it real quickly. It said, "And he said, 'Why? What evil has he done?'" But he may have not believed in Jesus, but he did not believe Jesus was deserving of the death that he was ultimately sentenced to. It's interesting when we look at who Pilate was and what authority that he had at the time Jesus was crucified. Of course, Pilate was a Roman governor who was set over this area. And he had the ability to disagree with the Jews and say, "No, this man is not guilty." But that's not necessarily what he done. But he did believe Jesus was innocent. He also, another thing Pilate did with Jesus was he had him beaten and flogged. Turn over to John chapter 19, verse 1, and it actually says just that when we look at the text there, that beginning with verse 1, it said, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." And then also we see that this was done, this sentence was ordered by Pilate in Mark chapter 15, verses 15. It said, "So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." So we know that Pilate gave the order to have Jesus beaten that night. He wasn't just simply taken to Golgotha and nailed to a cross, but he was beaten, not just from what Pilate had sentenced, but people were also hitting Jesus, spitting on Jesus, putting a crown of thorns on his head. Jesus had endured a lot of physical harm over the course of that night. And part of it was because of this order that Pilate gave. So that was one thing he did to Jesus. Another thing, if you'll turn back to John chapter 19, that Pilate did is at one time he actually sought to release Jesus. And in John chapter 19, verse 12, it says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, 'If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar.'" Now, one thing that's interesting here, Pilate, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, did not believe Jesus was guilty. And it says here he was seeking to release him. That was something he wanted done. But he was also afraid of a riot on his hands. And ultimately, the reason Pilate decided to do absolutely nothing was because he was afraid the Jews were going to riot and cause an uproar and cause a mess. So he did that simply to appease the Jews. So, but it is important to know that he did seek to release Jesus. And then ultimately, he had Jesus crucified. And there's a really interesting thing he does. If you'll turn back to Matthew 27, when he's getting ready to sentence Jesus to this death. Let's begin reading verse 24, Matthew 27. It says, "So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.' And all the people answered, 'His blood be on us and our children.' And he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified." I don't think sometimes we think about that statement that the Jews made that day. We look at different things that the Jews have gone through over the years, and I'm not necessarily claiming any blame, but it's interesting just to think about this statement that they made. They said, "Put his blood on us and our children." Just something to think about. But ultimately, what Pilate did with Jesus was absolutely nothing. He was the one who gave the sentence to crucify him. And he had the power to not do it. And he even said that to Jesus at one point. He said, "Don't you know with a spoken word I could have you sentenced or released?" And Jesus told him, he said, "You wouldn't have this authority had God not given it to you to begin with." But he ultimately did nothing with Jesus. And it's mentioned in the song. "Will you evade him as Pilate tried?" Second person who's talked about in the song here is Peter. Notice what it says in verse 4. "Will you, like Peter, your Lord deny?" Now, there's multiple things actually Peter did that night that Jesus was taken to be murdered. First thing that I think is really important to take a look at, flip back probably a page or so in your Bible to Matthew 26, is he had promised Jesus, he had boldly claimed that he would be willing to die with him. Let's begin reading in Matthew 26, verse 30. It says, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' Peter answered him, Though they fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said to him, Truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And it actually says there that all the other disciples said the same. So Peter did not have intentions of denying Jesus, at least based on this statement that he made. He had intentions. He's saying, I will die with you. If it comes to that, I will die with you. So he did. He claimed that he would be willing to die with Jesus. Another thing Peter did, and I believe the only account that mentions this is in Luke. We're told in Luke chapter 22, verse 54, that Peter followed Jesus at a distance. He stayed close with Jesus all night, and he was following him, and he was there with Jesus, and in fact, Luke mentions as Peter is denying him that him and Jesus actually make eye contact, and that is the only the only gospel that mentions that specific event happening. But they make eye contact after he denied him. But he followed along at a distance. Another thing Peter did that night is he cut a guy's ear off because he did not want them to take Jesus from him. And Jesus didn't look at Peter and say, well done, you're protecting me. He said, no. He said, put your sword away. Because Jesus was not intending on putting up a fight that night. But Peter, he did do that. But ultimately, we all know the story well. Ultimately, it was Peter who did deny Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jesus even told him. Real quickly, let's read beginning in Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 55. It said, When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, This man was also with him. But he denied, saying, Woman, I do not know him. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, You are also one of them. But Peter said, Man, I am not. And an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So yes, Peter ultimately denied Jesus 3 times. And like I said, it's something we're all well aware of. So we know what Pilate did with Jesus and what Peter did with Jesus. But here's another question I want to ask tonight is this. What will we do with Jesus? So, in Pilate's case, he did absolutely nothing. And there are people today who, when given the opportunity, do nothing when given the truth of Jesus. He believed that Jesus was innocent. He didn't necessarily believe that Jesus was who he said he was. The scripture doesn't really confirm that. Of course, there were many people who did not believe when they nailed him to the cross. The centurion believed when he saw what happened after Jesus died. But there are many people today who believe believe Jesus. Maybe even believe in Jesus, but do absolutely nothing about it. I talked a little bit about this morning. Action is something that is required of all of us. Without action, we can have the realization, we can have the determination, but without that action, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all. We don't want to be like Pilate. We don't want to just stand back and hope the situation takes care of itself, or do something to appease what everybody else is wanting him to do. We don't want to do that. We don't want to be that person, especially if we know what we need to do. Unfortunately, there are people out there who know what they need to do, but do absolutely nothing about it. Will you deny Jesus like Peter did? Now, when it comes down to it, Peter denied Jesus the 3 times he did because he was afraid. Because he was afraid they were going to kill him. Now, I would say that's a fear that probably no one in this room has experienced. Been faced with a situation where been faced with a situation, if you don't deny Jesus, you are going to die. Most of us have probably never been faced with that. And most of us may not know how we would react to that. Maybe we would react like Peter. Peter, he said, I'm not going to. Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. In Matthew's account of Peter's denial, we see a progression of his denial. At first, he kind of played dumb, and let's begin reading with verse 69 in Matthew 27. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. Me? I don't know what you're talking about. You're not talking about me, are you? And then the second time a person asked them, we see the second time a person asked them, notice what it says in verse 72. And again, he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. I promise, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm telling the truth. And then after a little while, bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. You sound like him. You have a similar accent to Jesus." Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." We see the progression here of Peter trying more and more to convince these people, I don't know who he is. And when we get to the last time, acting ungodly to prove he was not one of them. Think back to maybe before we obeyed the gospel. Did we deny Jesus? Did we reject Jesus? Now, we may have not done exactly what Peter did here, but if we did not obey Jesus, we were ultimately rejecting him. There were times, I think, when, thinking back to me and back before I obeyed the gospel, sometimes we try to make excuses as to why. Why don't I do this? Sometimes we make excuses. And it's something that we certainly, probably shouldn't have done. This is something Peter certainly didn't need to do, but of course Jesus told them that he would. There are a lot of people who deny Jesus and make excuses as to why they can't or won't obey his word. And that's really unfortunate. So Pilate did nothing. Peter denied Jesus. So for us, and kind of drawing on the last verse of the psalm, the question is, what should we do with Jesus? Well, first thing, we need to give Jesus our life. It says, Jesus, I'll give thee my heart today. We need to give Jesus our life if we haven't. That's what we need to do. Jesus, I'll follow thee all the way. We need to follow Jesus. Now, there's a misconception, I think, out there that a lot of people have, is that if I sign up to follow Jesus, it's going to be easy. We're not going to have any troubles, any issues. Everything's going to be perfect from now on. In Luke chapter 9, a man came up to Jesus and said, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said, that's great, come along. We're going to have a good old time. No, that's not what he said. He said, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's not going to be easy. He even told a man a few verses later, anyone who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for my kingdom. And using that in other terminology, is not fit for my church. Once we commit, there is no looking back. We have to follow Jesus all the way, as the song suggests. And then notice the last thing it says, gladly obeying thee. Part of following Jesus is obeying what he tells us to do. John 14:15, Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If we love God, if we love Jesus, we will follow him all the way. And we'll do what he asks. We'll obey what he says. So that's what we should do with Jesus. We need to give our lives to him. We need to follow him, and we need to obey him. Last question, and this is the question that the chorus poses at the very end, and this is one to really think about. And that's the question, what will Jesus do with me? Matthew 10, verse 30, beginning with verse 32 says, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. That's what Jesus will do in the end. And it depends on what we do, how we live, of what Jesus will do with us. Do we want to do nothing? Do we want to deny him? Or do we want to give our lives to him, obey his commands, and follow him for the rest of our lives? The decision is ours. So tonight, as we're getting ready to end up, I'm going to pose that question one more time. What will you do with Jesus? If you're here tonight and you need to respond to the invitation, either by repenting of sins or giving your life to Jesus for the first time, please do so while we stand and sing.
I know the Lord will find a way for me. I know the Lord will find a way for me. If I walk in heaven's light, shun the wrong and do the right, I know the Lord will find a way for me. Won't it be grand to hear him say, right. Won't it be grand?